The Socratic Club is finishing out its 21st year, and I started to count how many events I've organized over the years, or the club has organized over the year, and it's just short of 150, I think, which is kind of cool. So the club meets normally 4 times a semester and during the academic year, the remit or goal or aim of the club is to discuss Christian worldview issues in a broadly philosophical point of view. The Gonzaga Socratic Club takes its name from the Oxford Socratic Club, which was organized by students in the mid-1900s. And they invited C.S. Lewis to be the president of the club. So our club has a distant connection to C.S. Lewis that I think is a good thing. The interesting thing, there's a connection between the Oxford Socratic Club and the Gonzaga Socratic Club in our talk for today that I want to make explicit. That's kind of interesting. In the mid-1900s, there were clubs for just about everything at Oxford. There were sports clubs and literature clubs and different kinds of hobbies. But students realized, actually students brought this initiative to C.S. Lewis. They realized that there really wasn't a place for students to get competing worldviews together in one place. So if you were an Anglican, you could go to the Anglican club. If you were an atheist, you could go to the skeptics or the skeptics club or whatever. But those groups didn't get together very much, and so the students actually thought it would be a good thing to have something like that happen. And they enlisted Lewis, who was enthusiastic about the idea. And the club decided to, the members of the club, the planners and organizers, decided to name it the Socratic Club, which you might think is a little bit odd because we're not necessarily talking about Socrates. But the idea was to echo or follow a principle that you find Socrates expressing, to follow the argument wherever it leads, to bring people together and engage in rational discussion and about controversial issues, and to see where that conversation leads in a productive way. So as I've said, there's a connection to our speaker today. What we're going to hear about is the philosophical approach of an atheist philosopher, David Lewis, in carrying on dialogue with people who disagree in significant ways. So Lewis was, David Lewis, not C.S. Lewis, David Lewis was an atheist, but he was also very interested in communicating with and discussing and learning about the views of theist philosophers. And so that's what really started our speaker today on an interesting project, and he'll have a little bit more to tell us about the project itself. But our speaker today is Anthony Fisher, who's been at Gonzaga since the fall of 2022. He has taught in a number of places on the coast and in Australia, and we're fortunate to have him here. He has particular interest in analytic philosophy, hence the project that he's going to be talking about today. But he also, his research is focused on a novel narrative about the fall and revival of metaphysics. Maybe he'll tell us something about that during his talk. He's also interested in ethics and especially AI in connection with ethics. So if you would, welcome our speaker as he's going to speak on David Lewis in conversation with Christian philosophy.
Okay, thank you, David.
So, thanks.
Thank you, David, Dr. Calhoun, for inviting me to be in this space, and thank you all for being here. It is a pleasure to talk finally at the Gonzaga Socratic Club, and like David was saying, I'm going to try at certain points in the talk to talk about this line, follow the argument wherever it leads. We're going to have that theme come up, and a certain interpretation of that in David Lewis's work. So I'm going to dive in. The brief sort of overview is that David Lewis, an atheist, he said he was a contented atheist, meaning he was happy to be an atheist, but he was someone that still talked to theists, to Christian philosophers, and he did so in important ways where he would forward analytic theism, theism in the analytic tradition, and he develops what I call an epistemic methodology or a meta-philosophical approach to agreement and disagreement. And I'm going to tell you a bit about my work with David Lewis, also telling you who he is and his work and his views, but also extract this methodology or this meta-philosophy that he used, and then show you the important features of it, or the main features of it, and why I think it's a very attractive approach to engage in productive dialogue, instructive conversation with people. And this result is not just applicable to philosophy of religion, or between theism and atheism, but also any sort of disagreement or any topics that we have two or more opposing positions. It can be useful in those spaces as well. So I'll start with who was David Lewis. So David Lewis is one of the most influential philosophers of the analytic tradition in the second half of the 20th century. He's widely anthologized. His works have been heavily cited. He's like one of the most cited philosophers of the analytic tradition, and he influenced so many debates, and he set the agenda for so many questions that still get discussed today. He died in 2001, and more than 20 years on, his work is still true to his contemporary as stuff that people discuss in current debates. It shows you how strong his influence was. He was an American philosopher, and he taught mostly at Princeton University for his entire life. Now he falls in the second half of the 20th century, and there's this area of philosophy called the history of analytic philosophy, where philosophers like me go and they sort of try to uncover the history of analytic philosophy. And usually this, what happens is we talk about people from the early 20th century, the middle of the 20th century, but only now, as we're getting into the 21st century, are we starting to talk about figures of the late 20th century and seeing them not just as contemporary figures, but also as historical figures in a historical tradition. So we have, in the late 20th century, these folks now being added to the canon of analytic philosophy. So when you would tell the history of it, you would start to mention these figures, and we get up to the present moment. I mean, Quine is certainly in this tradition from the middle of the 20th century, as we get to Hilary Putnam, Donald Davidson, Saul Kripke, Ruth Barton Marcus, Jack Wong Kim, and now David Armstrong and David Lewis, and also recent philosophers. They're now contemporary and becoming historical figures. And some of my work is showing how we can think of people like David Lewis and David Armstrong in a historical light, as historical figures who influenced and impacted the tradition, the analytic tradition. Okay, so what did David Lewis believe? So there's many things that he sort of argued for, and he was most influential in metaphysics, in epistemology, philosophy of language, philosophy of mind, a bit of logic as well, but not so much in philosophy of religion, and I'll get to that in a moment. But he's, of course, well known for the things that he had the most influence on. Here are three main sort of things that he accepted, and there's a couple of isms here to sort of work through. So the first is empiricism. So he had a scientific or scientistic approach to philosophy, where he thought that when it came to common sense and what common sense says, what science discovers, and what math says and logic, those things should be respected. We shouldn't contradict or conflict with those things, what those things say. When we do philosophy, that is. He also was a materialist, He also had a Humean approach, named after David Hume, early modern philosopher. He is also believed in modal realism. I'll explain that too. That's his theory of possible worlds. If you Google David Lewis, you'll probably come up with his theory of possible worlds. That's a thing he's notorious for. And then, of course, he's an atheist. These are all three relevant doctrines for us to understand in David Lewis. So empiricism, to broad strokes, is this approach in philosophy where we look to experience as our ultimate source of knowledge and understanding. That's where our knowledge bottoms out in, and that experience is sensory things. So experiential content's the sort of loose general word for this, where we appeal to our sense impressions, things to do with our touch, sight, hearing, and so on, our perceptions, and all those things are the bottom data, and we build up our theory and our knowledge of our concepts based on that. And even the very general doctrine of saying empiricism, that too bottoms out in some experience. So the empiricists think everything bottoms out in experience. The opposing view, the rationalist view, thinks that that's not true. Some knowledge comes from outside of experience or separate from experience. That's a general rough description. Speaking to some of the other etc. of the empiricism, as I was just saying, when Lewis says that we should respect common sense, he thinks things like when we say, I have hands, and I hold my hands up and say, here's one hand, here's another, that's something we say in our common sense moments, and he thinks that's true, and we should accept that, and our philosophical theory should not deny that. So if our philosophical theory following Descartes or the arguments about skepticism from, say, are we in a matrix? It turns out we don't really know we have hands. Well, we should not buy that argument working through this idea that we're in the matrix. We should not buy that argument when it comes to common sense. We should go with the common sense view that we have hands. Same in science. The science tells us about the fact that there is a physical world, and it can explain various things that we experience. We can discover laws of nature, and those things are real, and so on. And our philosophy shouldn't conflict with that either. And the same with mathematics and logic. Is materialism sort of connected to this sort of respect for science? Is to say that the world is entirely physical, and it's reducible to things that we can discover, or physics discovers. So you can think of fundamental particles, whatever they are, maybe they're quarks, or things in a field, and they have certain properties, extended relations, and everything else is big, vast complexities of spatiotemporal patterns. So things about biology and chemistry and so on, they all reduce down to physics at the physical level. This also means that there's no supernatural forces for David Lewis, and you can kind of see where some of the atheism is coming from now. So our world is a spatiotemporal field of distinct space-time points, and you have a property or a quality at those points, and those things stand in certain relations to each other, and that's your manifold, your spatiotemporal field, and then everything else supervenes on that. And he calls it a Humean mosaic, so named after David Hume again, where you have these little things, all like little dots on a big piece of paper, and that's all there is, and everything else that comes from that is supervenes or depends on that. The last sort of sentence here, our world is one among many possible worlds, that's the modal realism part. So he believes that our world, the actual world, is one world, and then there's many other possible worlds just like ours. So you can imagine our world, so at the top left there, and you've got Mrs. N. This is from a New York cartoon from the 80s. And we have Mrs. N baking some cookies, and that's our world. But then there are other possible worlds, and those worlds are no different in kind to ours. So they have real things, they're concrete, they exist. These things, some of them have life, and you've got things like universe number 7833298601, the top right, and there's another person there, Mrs. BBB, and that person's making pilokas, whatever they are, And then we have more remote possibilities from our world. And these things these things also exist as well. When we try to understand this idea, we think of, say, Mrs. VVV. She's the counterpart of Mrs. N in our world. And the clock, there's the different corresponding clocks, those would be counterparts to each other, and the context kind of sets that for us. And this is the notorious bizarre theory that he held, and he sincerely believed it. So there are worlds where there are talking donkeys, there are giant crayons the size of skyscrapers, and whatever your imagination can conjure, so long as it's logically consistent, it exists, and there's an infinity of these possible worlds. Now, I'm not going to get into why he believes this, but he's got arguments that he presents, and there's a whole book on this that he wrote. But that's the theory, and it's known as modal realism. And most people in philosophy don't accept this theory. They thought it was too far removed from common sense. Speaking about common sense, many people didn't buy it, particularly because it violated common sense. Okay. Good, right, let me jump over. I have a music video that's supposed to illustrate the materialism part, and I'll show a little bit of it for you to understand the point that he's making. And we don't need the sound, so this is how his reductionism or materialism is supposed to work. You can think of these guys on their little scooters as fundamental particles, and they have properties like wearing black suits and so on, and then they move around in space, and this is their space. They stand in special relations to each other, and they can move around, and they can do things like they're singing a song, going around in a circle. And this is all taken in one shot, by the way. And there's a drone involved. They're going to jump ahead. So they come out. So they go up like this. Is all on the one take video, music video. So from this perspective, we can see some patterns starting to emerge. And again, you can think of these people as fundamental particles in a space. And then we start to see different patterns and different things presented to us. And it all goes on to more complexity. The guys now get umbrellas, and they go up again. That's going to get more complicated. And you should watch this at some point. It gets more complicated. There we go. It gets bigger and bigger. Again, it's all one shot, so very impressive. But as they all come together from this sort of perspective with this complexity, we get patterns that we can detect. So for Lewis, the intuition here is there's nothing over and above. So the things we see right now, these are Japanese characters, and there's a love heart, a couple of love hearts there, and some faces of the musical artist there. They are nothing over and above all the little bits, and that's it. So that's all there is to reality, just those fundamental particles. There's nothing else there, just those things. That is our mosaic, and that mosaic can produce these things, this complexity that we can see at this sort of level. So it's a reductionism that he goes with. Okay. Right, so now I talk a bit about Lewis's life, get into my project, then circle back to the philosophy of religion. Okay, so here's Lewis in the 50s. So he was raised agnostic in Ohio, and his parents, or his father at least, taught as a professor at Oakland College. Lewis didn't go to Oakland College, he went to Swarthmore College. You can see in the background there, Lewis, he wrote an autobiography at the age of 14. I guess you can sort of do that. You can see there, it's very sort of mature mind. He's talking about his early childhood, babyhood, and so on. My New England years. I travelled around a bit, the family. And he writes at the very end, this is page 39, page 40 is the end of his autobiography. And at this very young age, being raised agnostic, we start to see some of his religious beliefs coming out. So he says, I feel there must be a cause for everything, that the past determines the future, that there must be certain natural laws, or even just one, such that it'd be possible to deduce all the features of the universe from it alone. This is a scientist's way of looking at the universe. I do not deny that there may be other ways which can reveal truths, unknowable from the viewpoint of pure reason. Religion is such a way, so perhaps is art. My feeling about religion is that I cannot accept the elaborate system of details which organized religion tends to build up, that it is in conflict with all reason, so he says. And this is sort of expressing his agnostic, and then it's going to become an atheist sort of picture as he matures. But even still, he maintained this lasting, intense interest in religion and the philosophy of religion. So he taught seminars on the problem of evil at Princeton in the 80s and in the 90s, and right in the semester he died. So the semester he died, unexpectedly, in 2001, he was teaching a seminar on the problem of evil. And he didn't even finish teaching it. He had planned it. I actually have his syllabus. And he died sort of midway in that semester, sadly. He's known for defending materialism and in the philosophy of mind, and the philosophy of science, but he didn't ever teach a seminar in the philosophy of mind. He didn't do that, but he taught many times. He taught the seminar on the philosophy of religion. He also discussed philosophy of religion with Christian philosophers, and I'll name a few in a minute. And this was a lifelong, protracted, detailed interest in this topic. For someone who's an atheist, usually someone who's an atheist just doesn't have much of an interest at all in these matters and doesn't want to really talk to theists. He also published some papers in the philosophy of religion. The first one from 1970, Ansel and Actuality. It's more about showcasing some of his theories in metaphysics than about Anselm. So it's more about actuality, his view about what's actuality, than about, say, Anselm. But he does talk about the ontological argument in that paper. The other two are more directly about the philosophy of religion. Evil for Freedom's Sake is on the problem of evil, and Free Will Theodicies. And he's talking directly to Plantinga in that paper. And that's from 1993. And then Do We Believe in Penal Substitutions from 1997. And that's talking about the atonement and how we can understand penal substitution, particularly in the context of Jesus dying for our sins. So he also wrote letters. So David Lewis was a prolific writer of letters, not just to people who study philosophy of religion, but to anyone and everyone. So he wrote thousands and thousands and thousands of letters, and here's a showcase of some of them. Some to Alvin Plantinga, a well-known Christian philosopher, theist. There's Peter Van Inwagen as well here. Okay, so talk a bit about my work on David Lewis. So I write and have written directly on his metaphysics and trying to understand it in itself, and then I've also taken a historical angle on his work as well, thinking of him as a figure in the history of analytic philosophy. So it took me to his letters, to his archive, to the material that survived after he died. And that got me in touch with Steffi Lewis, his widow. So these are some of the books that I've been involved in, publishing work on David Lewis or his letters. So the first two volumes here are just letters by David Lewis to anyone and everyone, organized into different topics of metaphysics and philosophy of mind and language and epistemology. The first book, the one that's in red, it's about 800 pages. It's just a lot of material that he showing you how much he had written in his correspondence. There's no published writings in this. And then the second volume is about 500 pages, so it's also pretty substantial. The middle book is just a collection of essays that I co-edited, and they on his philosophy, but they make reference to his letters and what he said in his correspondence, as well as in his published writings. The letters help inform how to understand David Lewis's his work. And then the last thing here, this is coming out this year, and this is the two-way correspondence between David Armstrong and David Lewis. That's a complete correspondence between those two philosophers. Okay, so my work's based on the archive. So I met Steffi Lewis, his widow, about in 2010, 2012, and then I went to her house in 2014, so the Lewis's house in 2014 in Princeton, and I started to work with her, going through the letters, the papers, the unpublished stuff, trying to make sense of it and how to preserve it and how to do things like publish it because it was that worthy of publication. But Steffi Lewis, like sort of a personal note, was also very attached to this material as well. So she didn't really want to let it go. It really should have been in a university archive. But with my work, I sort of helped to turn the corner with this, and we got some of that stuff published in a research project and got some funding to put that stuff together. And then finally, we got the archive moved to Princeton University. So they're showing you some of my Facebook profile now. So here's me in the Lewis's home. This is going through the files. So I worked through them over many years. This is in 2016, so you can see younger me. In 2016, and then I literally helped box the stuff up. And then the Lewis just lived a short walk down the road from the university. So that's my car. And we boxed it all up and then drove a mile down the road and put it in the depot at the university library, and off it went. And that's where it is today. So you can get on there and you can find the papers and you can access some of it online. All the stuff's there to be used. And it's there for as long as Princeton University is going to be open, which I hope is for a long time. Okay. Okay, so the current project. So I've published a few volumes of letters. So here's some more stuff. This is now going back to the philosophy of religion stuff. So the current project is to publish this book. The manuscript is more or less together and complete with the volume of the letters. And it's called David Lewis and the Christians. That's a volume of selected letters on the philosophy of religion between Lewis and his Christian philosophical interlocutors. And it's co-edited by Steffi Lewis. And she started this project very soon after David Lewis died. She actually wanted to publish many volumes of his letters, but as she was getting older, her work rate slowed down, and she just couldn't manage the project herself. She needed a philosopher to help her, and even a number of people, because I had sort of co-editors who helped me as well. This was a little pet project of hers, and I joined her in 2016 on this project. And sadly, she died in 2019, so my co-editor is no longer with me. But we did work on it for some years, and we also got Peter Van Inwagen to write a foreword for the volume as well. So he's done that, and I've written the introduction, and some of the things I'm saying today are sort of based on the introduction that I've written. So the book, the manuscript, is getting to a very sort of final state. So again, sort of more from my Facebook page. Okay, so Lewis corresponds with Plantinga, Peter Van Inwagen, Marilyn Adams, Bob Adams, Phil Quinn, John Bishop, John Leslie, Peter Forrest, and many other Christian philosophers in the volume. And then there are others too. Some of these people are not theists. So Jonathan Bennett, Keith DeRose, Michael Tooley, John Martin Fisher, Calvin Normore, and Curley, and many of these folks are still alive today. And he corresponded about topics like the problem of evil, free will theodicy, which is trying to give an explanation based on free will for why God would permit evil. There's also the many worlds theodicy as well, where there's many worlds and ours is one world. Maybe it's not the best world, but it's a world that's got some value to it. He talked about counterfactuals of freedom, about counterfactuals with our free will, which gets into a lot of technical logic, which I won't discuss here. He also discussed God's agency, penal substitution, as we saw from that article that he published in the late 90s, and again, atonement. He also talked about the anthropic principle and divine evil, and finally, life everlasting. It's just kind of funny how this stuff happens. At the end of his life, unexpectedly died, he's writing on what does it mean to have life everlasting, and he's thinking through quantum mechanics and the ever interpretation of quantum mechanics and branching worlds, thinking there's a sense in which you can continue to live forever. This is right happy. It's like happy in the sort of months leading up to his unexpected death. And some letters of his that are just a couple of days before he died, where he's talking about divine evil in these letters to, for example, Jonathan Bennett. Okay, so what's the significance of this project? So he influenced analytic theism indirectly through his correspondence. So he had an impact on the shape of theism in the analytic tradition, even though it's not obvious to that sort of body of material produced by people like Plantinga, Peter Van Inwagen, and so on. And although he was an atheist, he engaged in respectful, reflective correspondence on issues that he fundamentally disagreed on with his interlocutor. And then this his approach to philosophy of religion helps us understand other parts of his philosophical system. So if we want to understand what he says elsewhere, we can go to the philosophy of religion and make some connections and go back. So if you're a Lewis nerd like me, then this is helpful for you. And then also philosophy of religion is a gateway topic as well. Thinking about it can send you to issues about the nature of mind and metaphysics and epistemology and things like that. So it's very an intellectually fruitful area of philosophy. And we find in Lewis what I call an epistemic fair-mindedness, and this is where we get to the meta-philosophy, or the epistemological methodology that I'm going to go through on how we can discourse about intellectual matters. He also had a care and admiration for fellow Christian philosophers. And he does say things like he admires his Christian philosophers. So here's Marilyn Adams, so we give backstory here. So here's Marilyn Adams, and in the 80s, she was trying to become ordained as a priest in the Anglican Church. And I don't know all the backstory, but there was some attempts, and she was trying to find a way to fill out this vocation. And David Lewis is a friend of hers, and Bob Adams as well, her husband. And Lewis writes from Auckland in New Zealand, and he was talking to John Bishop, a friend there, and there was something in the paper there, as you can see from the letter here, about an issue of can a woman become a bishop in New Zealand? And then Lewis goes on to say, well, what's interesting here is that it's common for women in the Anglican Church in New Zealand to be priests. So they're talking about bishops here. So it's like there are many priests that are women in New Zealand. And then he goes on to say, maybe you should move to New Zealand. I think this could help you out. I'm thinking of you, and this is something that could help you out. So now what happens in like 1987? Marilyn Adams does get ordained as a priest in the Diocese of Los Angeles, and then she's a priest, and then she's there for much of her life, and then she goes to Oxford and Rutgers and stuff like that on the East Coast of America. But here's just an example of Lewis thinking of his fellow Christian philosophers and about their life and their vocation. So here's the motivation of the talk. We're going to get into some more philosophy now. So we can sort of set things up with some questions that Lewis can give us some answers to. In the background, you've got his train. He's an avid train collector, and in his basement he had this complete track. And this is the photo of it that I took. And he had some sort of form of autism, or Asperger's, and so he'd do philosophy on his typewriter, and then he'd go into the basement. That's like the two things that he did. Okay, so if two people hold entirely opposite positions or something, so again, you can take theism or atheism, how can they talk about, say, the subject of God? If two people know they can never change the other person's mind, why should they continue to talk to each other? So there's no chance of converting the other person. Why have a discussion? If two people engage in a debate, and the debate ends in deadlock or stalemate, what should we conclude? What should we do when we have a stalemate and the debate doesn't go anywhere after that? So those questions, I think Lewis can give us an answer to. As I said, the way I'm describing it is a epistemological methodology, or you can call it a meta-philosophy. I'm not too concerned about words we use. But that's the sort of idea, and I'm going to sort of go into that momentarily. I'm going to give you a bit of history on analytic philosophy and religion. I'll mention Plantinga, the connection to Plantinga briefly, and then get into the methodology stuff. Okay, so in the middle of the 20th century, the philosophy of religion, the area, wasn't really much discussed. It was ridiculed and banished into not really a subject worthy of discussion in philosophy. And this is in the analytic tradition, as it's becoming its own thing in the middle of the 20th century. So this is A.J. Ayer, a well-known logical positivist. And the logical positivists were very dominant at this time, and he argued that talk of God doesn't make any sense. When we use the word God as a term, it's a metaphysical term, and there's no way to confirm or verify any statement about God. Like, what would be the thing that verifies? What would be the evidence to verify, say, that God exists? So it makes the sentence nonsensical. There's no, he says, literal significance. It says significance with the word meaning. So any statement about God, that God exists, or God is great, or God is all good, they have no meaning, I mean, according to Ayer, given this criteria that logical positivists use. In this time, though, early on in the 50s, we start to get some discussions of the philosophy of religion. So here's a work from 1955. It's an edited work by Anthony Flew. He's an atheist, and then McIntyre, who's a theist, a Christian, and they produced this volume in 1955 where they started to talk about God and religion more seriously, and it was under the name of philosophical theology. So we had some interest return to questions of religion in the analytic tradition, but it was still constrained by this focus on language and the logical positivist project. So it's only when those things wane, when logical positivism starts to die away, and this is the time when we get Quine, and then Kripke, and then later David Lewis, analytic philosophers like David Lewis and David Armstrong, they bring metaphysics back, and analytic philosophers turn back to metaphysics and to like the nature of reality and so on, and it opens up discussions about God and religion, and we find philosophers like Plantinga expressing their faith in their philosophy. So, contra Ayer, we can say that statements about God are meaningful, and we can think through them and come up with hypotheses about the nature of God or whether God exists, and so on. So the subject matter is not banished anymore. So a lot of Lewis's letters are sort of in connection to Plantinga, and that sort of connection comes to when Lewis was a graduate student at Harvard. Plantinga was visiting at that time in the mid-60s. That's when they first met. And then Plantinga published an early important book, God and Other Minds, followed by two more slightly more important books in the 70s that Lewis absorbed and digested, and a lot of his letters to Plantinga are sort of based on reading of these two books. And Lewis too, so the guy in the background's John Bernheim. Lewis, when he visited Australia, he had a lot of conversations with Bernheim, who was a Catholic priest at the time, about the problem of evil, and those connections, those conversations stay with Lewis, and they get mentioned time and time again in Lewis's letters. So these are connections that kind of stay with Lewis. Okay, I'm going to get to the methodology now. So I got this in 3 points. So in the brackets I got points. So there's 3 points, and they're going to kind of build together, so we'll cascade together, and then we're going to get a picture emerging of this methodology and then we'll sort of end, and then we can go into questions after that. So the first point about the methodology, and this is sort of describing Lewis's approach, is to find consensus with your opponent. This is the person that you fundamentally disagree with, who holds the opposing view. So you start to find consensus in certain places, and you want to discern the shape of disagreement, where it is that we disagree. Now, of course, to do this, to find consensus, you need empathetic understanding. And he talks about empathetic understanding in a couple of places, where we put ourselves in the shoes of our opponent and try and see the world from their eyes. So here's a letter to Bob Adams, where he says, "Thank you for your good comments. It's really nice when philosophers who disagree as much as we do about the main issue can agree so well about the shape of the disagreement." And he's very emphatic here with the exclamation point as well. So finding the shape of the disagreement. Even though we disagree, can we agree on the shape? And I can talk about the shape in a minute. Note though, this is the second point now, that debate, when we have discussions, it often ends in deadlock or in stalemate, and we're not going to have, the other person's not ever going to budge. No matter what argument we give, they're just not going to be moved by it. They're always going to deny a premise somewhere or deny an inference. So there'll be no moving of the person, no converting of the person. Now, when this happens, what follows? So here's Lewis in the second paper on problem of evil, where he says, "I'm an atheist, so you might suspect that my purpose is to debunk free will theodicy so as to provide at last a knockdown, a triumphant knockdown of Christianity, a knockdown refutation." But then he says, "Not so, that's not what I'm doing. I'm convinced that philosophical debate always ends in deadlock, and in this case, in the case of the problem of evil, the false religion, there is no exception here." So when he argues in this paper that free will theodicy has difficulties, he means just that. He doesn't mean anything surreptitious. He's not going to hint slyly that he's got a reputation here. No, he wants to argue very sincerely that, look, I wish free will theodicy's success, some success, and I don't want to have proof that all the Christians I know, and again, he's thinking of Marilyn Adams, he's thinking of Phil Quinn and Bob Adams and so on, that they are muddleheads or even devil worshippers. That conclusion would be incredible, so not credible to believe, and of course unfriendly. And he has many friends who are Christians. On this point about debate ending in deadlock, he says, well, okay, what follows from that? Well, does it mean that anything goes, that we can believe whatever we want when we hit deadlock? Well, no. He says, I would insist that when debate over a philosophical question ends in deadlock, it does not follow that there's no truth in the matter, or that we don't know the truth, or that we ought to suspend judgment, or we have no reason for thinking one thing rather than another. So take the case of whether I have hands. So if someone says, I have hands, my opponent says, you don't know that because you can be in the matrix, we can quickly enter deadlock. He thinks, it still doesn't follow that I don't know that I have hands. In that context, that ordinary context, yes, I do know it, and I can hold on to that belief. I don't have to suspend judgment about that. And we can talk about that point a bit later if you would like, if you're curious to know a bit more. Now, I'm sort of bringing the first and the second point together. What we're seeing now is what I call an instructive disagreement or constructive disagreement, where this gives us a distinctive place for argumentation or argument when we do theorizing, when we do some philosophical thinking. What does argument do? What's its purpose? Just trying to think back to now. Socratic Club sort of follow the argument where the argument leads. So argument isn't supposed to be something that coerces you or forces you to believe something like, on pain, you must believe my argument. He doesn't think that's how argument works. As he said, we can always end in stalemate. There's no knockdown arguments. So argumentation and argument has a different role, a different place. And that place is to be actually constructive. So here's a quote from a speech he gave in 1991. It was recently published a couple of years ago. So he says, "The rules of debate make it always possible to achieve stalemate, therefore never possible to achieve victory. And yet, I think there is a cumulative growth of knowledge in philosophy. We learn more and more about what the menu of coherent positions on the great questions and the subsidiary questions looks like." To kind of think back to the shape of disagreement thing with Bob Adams. "We learn that if you want to say A, you're stuck with B, unless of course you dodge it by saying C, in which case you get to choose between D, which is daft, and E, which looks good, but unfortunately commits you to F, and so on and so forth." So we're looking at the landscape, the dialectical landscape. That's the shape that he was referring to before. So no amount of this knowledge of the menu, or the shape, can ever force you to think that, say, the will is free. So again, the argumentation doesn't force you to think that this or that. Still, it may help you make up your mind, to still help you work out what you want to believe. If we're lucky, it may lead all sensible folk to agree someday, maybe not. But if not, is this still useless? And he says, no, it's not useless. If a part of our project is to be well informed, to be reflective and think about our beliefs, about, say, free will or God or so on, well, then this isn't useless. It's a very important thing to use argumentation as this tool to find the menu, to find the shape of agreement or disagreement, to be more well informed and to sort of help us make up our mind. But the argument isn't going to be like the knife. So here's a certain interpretation of how we follow the argument where it leads. So he says in another letter, "I don't agree," says to Douglas Smith, "I don't agree with you at all that taking a side in philosophy involves a certain duty to refute rivals. I think philosophical debate, when competently done, almost always reaches stalemate. Your job is to arrive at a position you yourself can believe in, and then think it through well enough that your rivals can't refute you. So you take up a position, and then from that you use argumentation to probe, to construct your view, your vision. And then along the way, you have to come across problems or objections, and you respond to your objections, and then you keep going. As long as you can succeed, then you're entitled to believe your position, and it'll be something that's well informed, and it can help you decide the matter. And you can help make up your mind. Third point, and then, yeah, we're actually moving time. Excellent. Okay. Here's the third point, and this is the final point. Again, these points sort of trying to build to a picture, I hope. So in that same speech from 1991, he talks about another debate he had with Graham Priest, a logician, on the principle of non-contradiction. So the principle of non-contradiction says that you have P and not P. So my phone is red and not red. So red and not red. My phone, it's false that my phone is red or not red. It has to be either red or not red. So Lewis believes and thinks it's a principle of logic, and it's not the case that the phone is red and not red. So Graham Priest, though, he rejects that principle. He thinks there can be true contradictions. You can have something being red and not red at the same time. That's what Graham Priest believes. That's, the rough description. So Lewis, in his work in logic, came across Graham Priest, and Graham Priest gives a different type of logic, paraconsistent logic, as he calls it. We deny the principle of non-contradiction, and Graham Priest also references Indian and Buddhist logic as well to try and help his case. And Lewis doesn't know what to do against this opponent. And he says, and this takes many years for Lewis to realize this, all you can do against Graham Priest is to beg the question in favor of consistency, in favor of the law of non-contradiction, and thereby learn the value of dogmatism. So the third point is about dogmatism now. So Lewis was dogmatic about certain things that he believed. So he was dogmatic about the principle of non-contradiction. He believed it to be true. And then he was dogmatic about other things. Many of his own starting points, such as reductionism, which I can't explain with that music video, wait, okay, go. He believes that in a dogmatic way. In his work, he doesn't argue for it. He just assumes that that's true and then sees what follows. And then he builds up his theory using argumentation and argument to probe and make the theory bigger and bigger and make it explained as much as he can. So there's dogmatism in his framework, and this also relates to his atheism as well. I'm going to elaborate on this point about dogmatism by looking at another debate from the 40s between Bertrand Russell and another chap who's less known than Bertrand Russell. So I'll build up to this. So Bertrand Russell says, if we are to hold that we know anything on the external world, so that's the world external to our minds, we must accept the canons of scientific inference. Whether, when this conclusion has been reached, the individual decides to accept or reject these canons is purely a personal affair, not susceptible to argument when once the issue has been made clear. I, as a human being, of course, accept these canons. So he takes it to be a personal thing, no argument involved in believing the canons of scientific inference. And then we had Raphael Demos at Harvard University at the time respond to Bertrand Russell. And this is what Demos says. He says, "Fine, Mr. Russell. Now you have betrayed me. What? Belief? A personal matter not susceptible of arguments? And how you talk of what you, as a human being, can accept? Aren't Christians and Muslims human beings too? Surely you have not abandoned your democratic ideals." Demos sort of goes on like this. But what he's sort of frustrated with is this idea about we have the canons of scientific inference and Russell's being dogmatic about them. He's just saying these are right and I take it as a human being, and it's just purely personal. There's no arguments to believe the canons of scientific inference, the sort of empirical approach. Okay, so I'm going to try to relate what Demos says to Lewis now. So in the paper for 1945, where Demos is responding to Russell, he concludes if dogmatism is to be permitted, it should be permitted all round. So he's identifying in Russell, hey Russell, you're being dogmatic. And we can say a similar thing to Lewis. We can say, Lewis, you're being dogmatic in your materialism and in your atheism, and we should permit that all round. But then Demos goes on to say, and he sort of accuses Russell of doing this, of Russell being unreflectively dogmatic. Russell doesn't realize that he's being dogmatic. Russell thinks that he's right, and a theist, someone who believes in God, is dogmatic when they say, well, God exists, and I believe it as a truth, and there's no questioning it. But Demos says we should be dogmatic, and we should permit dogmatism all round, but we should be reflectively dogmatic. And what that requires is an awareness of dogmatism, that our beliefs are dogmatic. And we see that in Lewis, when Lewis says we learn the value of dogmatism, and indeed the necessity of dogmatism, when he was confronting Graham Priest. And we can see that too when Lewis confronts the theist as well. So Demos says, sort of concluding in that paper, and Lewis I think would agree, Demos says, I am not asserting that religious dogmatism is right because scientific dogmatism is wrong. I am pleading for more humility all round and for more philosophy among philosophers. So like Lewis would say, yes, we should be humble. Realize that argumentation isn't something that forces you to believe something. So we take the argument where it leads in a certain sense. We use it to do this probing and working out the landscape or the menu, the choices that we've got in front of us. And that we do so in conversation with each other, even with people we disagree with. So more philosophy among philosophers that don't agree with each other. So the theists and the atheists. Get more philosophy done and keep working out the menu, keep working out the shape of the disagreements, and we will be more informed, and our knowledge will progress. Okay, so yeah, okay, so so what we see here is Lewis as an atheist realizing that there's dogmatism in his philosophical framework, down to his materialism and even his atheism. And then, in a way, there's a matter of faith that goes on with his views as well. If you were to ask him, well, why do you believe in materialism or reductionism? He would say, well, that's just what I believe, and there's no, it's a personal affair, not susceptible to argument, and that's my starting point, and you're not going to budge me from it. So there's a matter of faith that he works with, and it's showing us that the atheist point of view is one that also has a matter of faith built into it, as well as the theist position also. But Lewis, as a very sophisticated philosopher, he was aware of that. So he was reflectively dogmatic, and then did the rich and constructive work that he has done in his work and also in his correspondence. So this is my last picture. This is a sketch of Lewis, and that's it. So thank you very much.
We have about a half hour for questions and discussion. Dr. Fisher, I'll let you handle the.
Yeah, of course. I can do that.
You teach undergrads. One of the complaints I get is, well, philosophy has a lot of questions and no answers. He seems to agree with that. How would you respond to it?
Yeah, so the point of philosophy, I would say, is we come up with some answers to some questions, but then we want to generate more questions and keep going with more questions. And that's part of the point of philosophy. So it's never ever, once we get to a settled question, then the philosophy, it's not as philosophical as it once was. So it's built into the nature of philosophy that we have some uncertainty there, and that there's questions that are left hanging that pushes our mind to keep probing and to keep thinking. So there's that sort of movement that goes on in the philosophical state of mind, and we see that in that quotation from Lewis where he talks about this one here, where when we start to say things like, if you say this, then you're stuck with that, and so on, that's going to raise further questions as we make those moves. And that's the drive, the engine in philosophy. And yes, it is different, intrinsically so, to science, for example, where you want to find a question and settled and an answer given, and then that's it. Whereas philosophy, there's always those questionings there.
How do you think Lewis would define sensible thought?
Yes, good. Okay, a couple of ways. So one is the common folk on the street and what they believe. So the common sense person believes that, like, I have hands, that they have hands as well. There's a real world. We're not in a matrix. That sort of thing. But he also understands sensible folk as philosophers when they think in a common sense way as well. So there's two readings of sensible folk. So the philosopher who can reflect in their commonsensical moments can get to some sensible truths as well. So for example, with one debate he has with Peter Van Inwagen is the debate over the existence of tables and chairs. So Peter Van Inwagen says, well, there are no tables and chairs. What there are is just fundamental particles arranged in a certain way. So the table here doesn't really exist. It's just particles arranged table-wise. Now Lewis says, well, hang on, I think there are tables. Tables exist, and I talk about them when I say there's a piece of paper on the table. I've referenced the table. And where do I get that truth from? Well, it's me as a philosopher in my commonsensical moments. And for him, he thinks we should respect that truth. So Peter Van Inwagen's got a cost to his theory when he denies that common sense claim that the sensible folk say that there are tables and chairs. Okay, well,
Maybe this gets us into hot water, but along those lines, you stated at the beginning that Lewis is an empiricist,
yeah.
and that he's committed to claims of common sense, and yet his modal realism seems to commit him to something that can only be proven or demonstrated logically, and the two seem at loggerheads. It seems to be totally unempirical to claim that multiple universes exist, or multiple worlds exist.
Yeah, so he argues that there are multiple universes, other possible worlds may exist, using like arguments, and he uses inference to the best explanation. So there's still some, I'm sort of giving you his sort of frame of mind here. We still use experience, we still use facts that the sensible folk believe, and then we do some inference to the best explanation. Here's a theory that's simple, elegant, can explain a lot, and doesn't depart too much from common sense. And that theory is the best explanation of all the stuff we need explained. And he thinks on balance, his theory is the one to believe. So he is using reasoning, and the empiricist doesn't deny that we have the faculty of reason. They just don't think that it's a separate sui generis thing from experience, or that our fundamental knowledge bottoms out in things, experiential things, sense impressions and things like that. But yes, of course, he wants to respect common sense, but then he says there are talking donkeys and so on. And you think, okay, that's not respecting common sense. So he does talk about that in his book, where he tries to, it all comes down to what we mean by actuality. So for him, and this comes out in that early paper, Answer on Actuality, what's actual is indexical, like the word now and here. So I can say I'm here, you can say I'm here, and we're both right. The word here is indexical, it refers to the person who makes the utterance. So he thinks actuality, or the phrase actual, functions like the word here or now. But the common sense person might not think that. They might think actuality is all that exists. And he's saying that there are other things that exist that aren't actual. Those things are possible. That's what these possible worlds are. But I think that's the point where why people don't accept his modal realism. It comes down to that issue. What is the nature of actuality? And he has a different take on it. But he doesn't give us more argumentation or an argument for his indexical theory of actuality. He doesn't say too much about it. So it is a limitation that I admit. And I'm not a modal realist, so I don't believe in talking donkeys and stuff like that. I have a different theory to explain possibility and necessity.
I think this is really in line with what you were just saying, though. Like, I also thought it was really contradictory to say that the law of non-contradiction talks about like counterfactual realism, where all these different things are possible. Is it like that? I think that it's actual realism.
Yeah. So the law of non-contradiction, that's going to be necessarily true. So what's necessarily true will be true in all possible worlds. So in every possible world, the law of non-contradiction holds, kind of like mathematical truths. The 2 + 2 = 4 is necessarily true, meaning it's true in all worlds. So no matter what the worlds are like, whether you have talking donkeys or people, some sort of robot making some sort of cookies, that's always going to be true. 2 + 2 = 4. Same with the law of non-contradiction. Like, it's not the case of P and not P. So he believes those necessary truths, but then so he accepts those claims, and then he just thinks of them as true in all possible worlds. But then things about materialism and even atheism, he also takes those things to be contingent truths as well. So there are worlds for him that are very far away from ours where you do have immaterial souls and you do have other supernatural forces, and you might even have a god or many gods. Some people say he was a polytheist because he does believe in worlds that have other, like, many gods in them. But of course, that's not the Christian God, because the Christian God is one that necessarily exists, so the Christian God must exist in all possible worlds. So he's a polytheist to, like, the description of God is a very restricted one. But yeah, it is a contingent truth, though, materialism and atheism for David Lewis.
So I really think this is great. So thanks for a really cool talk. And I appreciate sort of the admonition to be more humble, right, among philosophers. But you also said that Lewis isn't an anything goes kind of guy, right? So how do you reconcile that with the kind of reflective dogmatism that he seems committed to, right? Because I mean, I could be I'd be dogmatic about, you know, the Earth is flat, right? I could be dogmatic about any kind of proposition, right? So how does he save himself from the anything goes kind of view?
Yeah, so I think it will come back down to the respect for science, common sense, maths, and things like that, and logic. So in our ordinary moments, I think this does get a lot of this thing that gets him a lot of. He takes a lot of mileage with this. He wants to run with. In my common sense moments, I believe I have hands in the ordinary people outside of philosophy. We should believe what the scientists say and uncover. So we should go with those things being true, and we know those things better than any philosophical argument. So it's a kind of a Morean line. It's a sort of Morean approach, like G.E. Moore, following G.E. Moore. I know I have hands, and I know that better than any philosophical argument to the contrary. So it's not anything goes, because we have as our guideline respect for common sense, science, and mathematics, and logic. And then, but all the while, we still want to be humble, because again, he's not saying we know these things with rock bottom certainty. There's still a fallibilism here as well. We might be wrong, but this is, when it comes to like levels of credence, we can be pretty sure, even though there's some chance that we might be wrong. And I think that is guiding the anything goes. So when he says the point about, when he says the point here, you know, there is a fact of the matter, and there's a fact of the matter, and even though the skeptic might disagree with me, I shouldn't suspend judgment. I should still hold on to my judgment that I have hands, even though someone's trying to dispute me and say that I don't really have hands, I don't really know it, and we still have a reason to think that I know I have hands as opposed to not. And that comes back to the common sense thing, respecting common sense. And again, along that Morean lines. That's the sort of part of the guide. Yes. Yeah.
I hesitate to ask this because I'm out of my depth, but aren't there bridges that are a bridge too far? And so, for example, with respect to methodology, if he's dogmatically an a priori reductionist, then this is a question about best philosophical methods. And for lack of a better term, I would present the alternative to a reductionist approach by using another word, assimilation, as a completely, and so it's a choice of ways of proceeding methodologically right at the beginning. So it seems to me that here's a case of a dialectic of contradictories like you can. And then, so that's so far as method is concerned. Also with respect to atheism and theism, it seems to me that a physicalist is in principle already foreclosing something like a theorem of the supernatural or any kind of inquiry that would open onto a religious and theological horizon. It can't be taken verbatim, it can't be taken at face value. so that at the end of the day, atheism of the form of a physicalist, reductionist approach to the arrangement of the disagreement is going to be a non-starter out of the gate for, because, a non-starter for dialogue. I mean, that's what I meant by a bridge too far.
Right.
I mean, well and good, and it might even be true, but there's a kind of philosophy that opens onto a religious and theological horizon, and then there's a kind of philosophy that forecloses such a possibility as a matter of method and logic right at the starting blocks. So I'm trying to talk myself into a kind of either or here.
Sure. Yeah.
That would make, so we can still arrive at stalemates, and they still might be productive with respect to either party's further investigation. But at a certain point, and I'll just say, you see, there is a question here.
Yes.
I'll just say about
Yeah.
that.
Okay. I'll try and I'll process that. So, yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So we could have sort of two characterizations of. So there's what it sounds like. What you think Lewis is doing is he's got this. Yeah. The dogmatic as reflective, fine. It's humble, fine. Atheist, physicalist starting point, and he's going to traverse that line, and he might follow through all the consequences in a logical way, fine. And then in that sort of trajectory, there's no horizon, there's no possible horizon of conversion or change, right? And then, but then it sounds like what's implied is, in what you're saying is, maybe a better methodology is one where we might have people with contrary positions and have disagreements, but we should allow for a possible horizon where we might change our mind or be converted or something like that. And it seems that what Lewis has got is a more restricted thing where you can never change, like you can't change course. Is that part of what you're getting to? Because I think so. You said, well, there's a non-starter if Lewis follows his methodology. But I wonder. I mean, there's still room for a conversation, which he can have, and what he did have with the theist. So I think what we have here is his methodology, but also him living out the methodology as well. He actually wrote and spent the time to write hours and hours and hours, amongst other letters he wrote, with two theists, and he wasn't doing this because it was fun for him or anything like that. It was seriously trying to work out what he thinks is correct. So even though there might be no horizon, he may even have thought, yeah, you're never going to change my mind, right? So there's no possible horizon for Lewis, but he can still connect with the opponent. So I wouldn't say it's a non. It doesn't. We don't need to have the possible horizon for it to be not to be a non-starter. We could sort of tease out one starting point and go where it goes, but still have this awareness of alternative positions, which you can occupy too. So when Lewis talks about free will theodicy or God and so on, he's putting himself in the shoes of the theist and tries to see the world from their perspective and then see the implications of the theory and tries to make it as see how far he can take it. And he does just that. And then Plantinga's work, particularly stuff on counterfactuals, was very, very technical. Plantinga uses some of that work and expands on that in his own writings. So Lewis is actually helping out, saying to Plantinga, here's how you should understand your theory, and here's the consequences for your logic and counterfactuals. So I still think there's room for discussion, even though we might say in the end, or even at the beginning, right? we're not going to convert each other. But nonetheless, allow argumentation and argument to be constructive by building up your vision and my vision, and then see how they grow and expand and whatever.
I have a question that I think might follow on a couple of the questions that have been asked so far. It sounds like, if I'm understanding correctly, Lewis thinks that the primary value of reason is for tracing out implications of one's view. You talked about, he had in the talk that he gave there, where if you hold to position A, then that it links to this, and it gives you a sort of decision tree about beliefs that you can or cannot, that you will or will not have to accept if you hold that foundational position. You also described him talking about foundational commitments as faith commitments. But what I'm wondering is, does that mean they're faith commitments in the sense of being fideistic faith commitments? That, in other words, foundational beliefs that we hold are not believed. We can trace the implications of those beliefs, but we don't hold those reasons. We don't hold those beliefs for reasons. Is that correct?
Yes.
Or am I misunderstanding?
That's correct. So part of the dogmatism is there's no reason for why the claim is believed. So reductionism that he holds and saying there's no reason that supports that. He just has that belief. That's his starting point, and then he goes from there. And he says that with reductionism. One of the papers he just says at the beginning of it, I hold this to be a priori true. What is it? He says a priori reductionism is true, and then goes from there and he spells out the Humean mosaic materialist picture. So he does think that when it comes down to it, there are some claims that are epistemically based, so there's no foundational. And that will come down to things like a belief in God or not, which, and in a way, I just want to say there's a question of faith with that dogmatism as well.
The reason I ask is it sounds like if it's held fideistically, it sounds like it's this is surprising to me because it seems like we've ended up in a place where I think C.S. Lewis would say, I have to reject that because what that means is, and you connected this to the impossibility of converting someone else or changing someone else's view. Isn't that a fundamentally irrationalist position to hold? If I'm just blunt about it.
So that you can't. I mean, so
reason is only valuable in tracing out implications, but reason can never help us judge between human
competing theories.
Yeah.
You can do that. So yeah, I should be careful with what the description here. So argument and reason isn't coercive. So it's not going to force you to think something. You can always deny something in the argument. So there's that point. He does think that reason can help you make up your mind. So if you're unsettled on something, so if you have two options in front of you, using reason and argument can help you make up your mind. Okay, I think this is the more plausible theory, given some various reasons. Some people who are on the fence, so there's say someone who's agnostic and they've got theism and atheism in front of them, and they're looking at the different options and they look at the menu, then reason can help them make up their mind and not be agnostic anymore and say, okay, it's theism, let's say, that I think is true given the reason. So that is all, that he accepts that. But when we have these cases of stalemate, of deadlock, and it's a fundamental disagreement, then I think he's thinking, then we have some limitations to reason. I know I'm not going to convert Plantinga. Plantinga's never going to convert to atheism. He's going to always deny something. I can give him the problem of evil. I can argue that his free will theology doesn't work. He'll come up with some other explanation to say why God permits evil. and I'm not going to ever make him become an atheist. But vice versa too. Plantinga's not going to say anything or give some new free will theodicy that will then convert Lewis to it. And that's where the next best thing is exploring the menu and to be more informed about where we agree, which is going to be on the menu or the shape, and be happy with that. That's helpful to help me see the different aspects of how reason is working. Again, there is that limitation, I think, when it's those two extremes, and one side won't ever convert the other.
In the very early paper, he has kind of three options. He has scientists, which is his point of view. He has the religious and I think the artistic, right? And when you mention him like playing in his basement with his trains, that makes me think of him as a bit of an artist, right? So it seems like he has at least two of the three that he sketched out in that early, and I don't know if he held to those as three different things or sort of conflates religion and art later on or something. I'm just curious.
Oh, I see, right there. Yeah, he mentions, he puts religion with art and says maybe those are ways to find truths. Yeah, I mean, that's a very young sort of Lewis making some sort of off remark about religion and art together. So yeah, I mean, he thinks that those could be places where we can find some truth, but him as the scientist, even at that young age, thinks that's probably not where we're going to find like, the ultimate truth. But even for him, that's sort of been just accepting as fundamental the scientific approach, or the scientistic approach. And that's, again, that initial starting point, which I do want to say he's being dogmatic in that. It is a starting point, and a starting point isn't something that you have there's nothing that precedes it, that starting point.
He also said he starts as an agnostic, and then he becomes sort of hardened into an atheist, right? Is there a conversion moment for him where he sort of sets aside his doubts and says, I'm committed to this, or is it just kind of a gradual evolution of he's always that, and he just sort of accepts it?
I mean, there's no clear evidence when he makes that conversion. I think what happens is, as he goes on to undergraduate studies at Swarthmore College, and then moves to Harvard where he did his PhD, at that point I think he would have solidified as an atheist. Probably around the time that he met Plantinga as well. I don't know if they had much discussion about obviously religion. They certainly met at that time, and Plantinga was a theist and writing on philosophy of religion, and a bit older than Lewis as well. But he doesn't declare at some point, but he just sort of comes out. And it comes out of that scientistic sort of approach that he starts to see the implications of.
What do you think Lewis got existentially out of his conversations with Christian philosophers?
I think he found himself more sure about his atheism. He got more confidence, and it helped him make up his mind that the atheist picture was the correct one. Because he says he's a contented atheist. And what that means is he's happy in knowing that truth. So some theists might come to him and may come to him and say, but Lewis, you don't understand that you're missing out on so much more richness in your life. If you were to open yourself to God, then you have a more fulfilling life and feel more in your life and so on. And to that, Lewis was, well, no, I'm quite content, and I'm pretty sure of this contentness in the position. So existentially, I think that's what he got out of it. And he was reflective about that too. So I think the existential question, though it's not very explicit, because he's not, straight up, does not write on existentialism or got this in the front of his mind, but as he's living his life, existentially, I think he's just very confident and sure about his own view. And he does live his views. Another thing that is a very admirable about Lewis is that he lives his philosophy. He lives the views. He really believes them. He sincerely believes there are other possible worlds. He sincerely believes in materialism and atheism and so on. And often philosophers, particularly in the analytic tradition, around that in the late 20th century and even today, they don't live their views as much as they should. Often an analytic philosopher will just, here's a theory, and they do kind of this. They've actually divorced themselves from Lewis's point. They'll often say, I'll assume theism, let's say, and I'll see what implications arise. But I'm not a theist, I'm just going to concede the if you're a theist, what follows, da-da-da-da-da. And analytic philosophers can often write like that, and they detach themselves from the views they're talking about. They don't live them. And Lewis is someone who lived his views, and that's something that's what a traditional philosopher does and did. And analytic philosophy, I think, has gotten away from that. It's lost that. Analytic philosophers don't live their views anymore. I mean, it's sort of been generalised into some too, but it is a tendency in analytic philosophy that we don't live our views. But Lewis is a good example of doing just that. I think there's an existential sort of aspect to it. That is latent, but it is there.
So, and I don't mean to mislead Mark in any way, so contentment might be a reason to hold tightly to your dogma for existential content.
Okay, so can you say a bit more?
So, that he's a contented atheist, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So he's contented with his quote unquote dogmatism in that respect.
He's content with the starting point, which he recognises as a dogmatic one, and he's happy with that. He's happy to live that as well. So it's an existential point. He lives that view, and he's happy with that. Yeah.
So that existential value might be a reason to continue to hold tightly to your dogma.
Right.
It has this effect.
Yeah. I think it'd be true too of the theist as well. That the theist is content in their position, and they are living their view, then they should also have that same property or feature as well. And then Lewis would say too, like, to your credit, theist, like Plantinga believes and lives his view as well, and spends his life working out the theist picture using the analytic approach, and he's living his view.
I'm still a little confused on the shape of the argument. So if the two debaters are not agreeing on the outcome necessarily, you said that, or he said that, you could agree on the shape.
Yeah.
What exactly does that mean? I mean, is it actually plottable? Could you create the shape?
You could do a graph. You could do a mind map sort of thing with concepts or statements that linked to each other, like if this, then that. And we can see that just with this sentence here. So if we want to say A, then you start with B, unless C, and so on. You could plot that. You could map that. And as we get into further complexity, which he is saying is possible because he has the ellipsis there, so it goes on. You could, with that greater complexity, start to see some sort of shape in this sort of very complex menu, and that's what we agree on. So we may not agree on the positions on the question of, say, whether God exists, but we can agree on the moves, and we can agree on the big map, the shape, the geography, the topology. We want to use those words as well as shape, and that's where we can get some productivity and some progress, because we're not going to convert each other, particularly on the fundamental disputes, but we can at least be productive by finding the agreement with the moves and the shape.
Can you apply different positions to like a previous shape? Like if you discover the shape of an argument and then try to apply potentially a different argument to that same shape?
You could go to that level. So you could start to say, okay, hang on, we disagree about the shape, and then let's try and find with this shape or the menu where we agree and where we disagree, and then that could help you start to find, well, here we disagree with this region, but this region we agree on, and you see, you could talk at that level as well. And Lewis would also say that's a productive thing to do. It's fruitful in discourse, in debating things. Yeah. Yeah, nice.
Did Lewis ever engage in interfaith dialogue? He's been identified as it applies to Christian
Yes,
philosophy.
yeah. He didn't. So he recognised, yes, there are other faiths, but he didn't discuss them in detail in his work or in his letters. So, and the people he corresponded with were Christians, and those friends, the friends he had who were religious, were also Christians as well. So there wasn't much of that interfaith dialogue. Sadly, because maybe he might have had other things to say, but it just didn't happen.
I think we're out of time. Let's thank Dr. Fisher